Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. When a violent criminal actually achieves the political goal he was aiming for, how do we as a society sort of balance the necessary condemnation of the act with this deep, unsettling understanding, maybe even empathy for the motive behind it? That's the really complex moral and legal tightrope Japan is walking right now. We're talking about Yamagami Tetsuya, the confessed killer of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. Specifically, the surprising and frankly enduring public sympathy surrounding him 3 years after the assassination, as his trial actually begins this month, October 28th, 2025.
Yeah, and the legal side is, well, quite stark. Yamagami admitted it plainly. Everything is true. I did it. So the trial isn't really about if he did it.
Guilt is conceded.
Exactly. It's about the punishment. And that could go all the way up to the death penalty. But what makes this case so unique, perhaps, is that the panel of lay judges, these are ordinary citizens, remember, they have to wrestle with this huge social context.
The context that's fueling this widespread, slightly uncomfortable public reaction?
Precisely. It forces the court, really, to deal with questions of institutional accountability right alongside criminal justice.
Okay, let's try and unpack this a bit. Maybe start with the core tragedy that drove the crime itself. Abe was shot twice, broad daylight, July 2022.
A shocking event.
Absolutely. And while the act itself, the assassination, was condemned universally as political violence, this sympathy for Yamagami's motive has been surprisingly strong, and it hasn't really faded, has it? Even now, 3 years later.
No, it really hasn't faded. And to get why, you have to understand the sheer depth of his family's ruin. I mean, Yamagami's father committed suicide when he was just a child.
Awful start.
Then his mother got deeply involved with the Unification Church, and she ended up donating something like 100 meters.
Which is, what, about $650,000?
Roughly, yes.
Yeah.
And the allegation is that this completely bankrupted the family. Now, the church claims they returned about half, but the damage was clearly done.
And it didn't stop there.
Yeah, no. Then his older brother also committed suicide. Just crushed, apparently, by the weight of their circumstances. So this wasn't just, financial hardship.
It was a total collapse.
A complete collapse of his immediate family structure. And in his mind, it was all attributed solely to this one institution, the Unification Church.
That's an almost unimaginable string of tragedies. But the rage, it wasn't directed at the church itself in the end, was it? It was displaced.
Exactly. He couldn't, or felt he couldn't, reach the church leadership directly. So he targeted Abe. Why? Because he saw Abe send a congratulatory video message to a church-affiliated event.
So in Yamagami's mind, Abe became the public face, the political link.
The political enabler, yes. The symbol of the institution that had, from his perspective, destroyed everything he knew and loved.
And you're saying that displacement, that specific targeting, is what the public sympathy latched onto?
Precisely. And I think what's really fascinating here, and maybe gets missed sometimes, is that this public reaction is probably better understood as a profound institutional backlash.
Not necessarily approval of the act itself.
Definitely not normative approval of assassination. People aren't celebrating political murder. What they're doing is venting decades, literally decades, of frustration against the Unification Church's fundraising practices, which many see as predatory, and the ruling party's, quiet cooperation with them over the years.
How do we actually measure that sympathy, though? Is it just, angry comments online, or is it more substantial?
Oh, it's very tangible. And that's why the court really has to take it seriously. I mean, immediately after his arrest, you saw these crowdfunding efforts spring up.
For his legal defense.
Yes, raising enormous amounts of money.
Mm-hmm.
And tens of thousands of people actually signed petitions arguing for leniency, specifically pointing to his background and the church's role in his family's destruction.
So the online stuff, the memes calling him a hero, that's just the surface.
That's the surface noise, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual financial support, the petition signatures, that suggests a much deeper, more mainstream recognition that his grievance against the church was seen as legitimate, even if his response to it was utterly illegitimate and criminal.
Okay, and here's where it gets incredibly complicated, right? Because the assassination, horrifying as it was, actually achieved his stated goal. It forced the Unification Church right back into the national spotlight after years of scandal simmering under the surface.
It absolutely did. And the direct policy consequences were sweeping. They almost instantly validated the public's underlying grievance.
How so?
Well, the government was essentially forced to acknowledge these extensive, decades-long ties between the church and the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP.
And these weren't just casual connections.
Not at all. These connections were politically valuable. The LDP is generally conservative, and they value the church's strong anti-communist stance and, crucially, its ability to mobilize voters come election time.
So a quid pro quo, almost. The church gave political support.
And the politicians, implicitly or explicitly, offered quiet protection, maybe access, legitimacy.
That context is just vital, isn't it? Because once that spotlight hit those ties, the political fallout was immediate and massive.
Absolutely massive. You had, 7 cabinet ministers forced to resign as their connections came to light? But the really big institutional change was the government moving to strip the church of its religious corporation status.
Which is hugely valuable.
Enormously valuable. It grants significant tax benefits, among other things. Taking that away is a major blow.
So if that status is stripped permanently, it fundamentally changes the Unification Church's power, its financial structure, its standing in Japan. That's a huge policy outcome.
Huge outcome achieved, disturbingly, through this act of violence. And we need to track the timeline here because it's still playing out. A Tokyo court did formally revoke the church's religious status back in March 2025.
Okay.
But crucially, the church immediately appealed that decision in April.
So it's not over.
It's not over. And if you connect this back to the public mood, the empathy or maybe tolerance for Yamagami is sustained not just by his tragic backstory, but by this active, ongoing policy movement. The courts and the government are, in effect, demonstrating that Yamagami did expose something real and institutionally corrosive about that church-LDP relationship.
But isn't that an incredibly dangerous precedent? If a violent act leads directly to major policy changes that address a public grievance, doesn't that risk lending a kind of perceived legitimacy, maybe culturally, to the violence that triggered it?
That is the absolute core tension this trial throws into sharp relief. If the public perceives that the system only corrected its own deep failures, decades of looking the other way regarding the church's practices because of an assassination, well, that sends a deeply disturbing message.
And the court has to navigate this somehow.
Exactly. The sentencing has to address this. Since guilt isn't in question, the defense is leaning entirely on arguing for leniency. They're focusing on the mitigating circumstances, his background, the poverty, the institutional victimization he suffered.
Now, I remember the sources mentioned something about a technical legal argument about the weapon itself. Is that significant?
Well, it was raised. We should probably mention it just to show the defense strategy, but frankly, it feels like a bit of a distraction from the main event.
What was the argument?
They argued his homemade weapon, this kind of duct tape pipe gun, might not technically meet the legal definition of a gun under Japan's very strict firearms laws.
Seemed unlikely to sway things much.
Highly unlikely, given the weapon was clearly lethal, given he admitted the act, given the whole public context. The real focus for the lay judges, surely, is going to be on his background and intent, the circumstances that led him there, not the semantics of the weapon.
So the real legal battleground is mitigating circumstances versus the absolute wrongness of political assassination.
That's it, precisely. And you should think about the psychological burden on those lay judges. They had to uphold the rule of law, condemn the act, but also acknowledge the systemic failures that came before it. Failures that, the resignation of 7 cabinet ministers basically confirms were real. The mitigating story is his life, not the gun.
And this whole phenomenon, casting a killer as some kind of avenger against a disliked system or institution, that's not unique to Japan, is it? The materials drew some international parallels.
No, it definitely fits a wider, quite disturbing pattern. We're seeing more of these lone actor threats, often fueled by deep-seated grievances, sometimes amplified online. Look at the U.S. case, Luigi Mangione, accused of killing the United Healthcare executive Brian Compson in 2024.
Right, there was a similar online reaction there.
Exactly. In both the Mangione case and the Yamagami case, you had these vocal minorities, online primarily, casting the accused as a sort of system avenger. The public distaste for the victim's institution, whether it's the Unification Church or a massive healthcare corporation, seemed, for some, to actually outweigh the revulsion at the murder itself.
Which, again, isn't cultural approval of violence.
No, I think it's better read as a very sharp indictment of the institutions themselves.
And Japanese officials seem to be treating this seriously as a specific kind of security threat, separate from, say, organized crime or traditional terrorism.
Yes, their policy response shows that.
Yeah.
The government actually created a dedicated police unit specifically to deal with lone offender threats. That reflects the anxiety not just after the Abe assassination, but also after that awful 2021 Joker train attack.
Where the man dressed as the Joker attacked passengers.
Right. Attacked people with a knife, started a fire. Officials recognize they're dealing with a pattern. often isolated men, stewing in grievance, sometimes finding this performative validation online. And they realize they need new, specialized strategies to try and detect and deter these individuals.
So, as we look ahead towards a verdict, which I guess is expected sometime early next year, what are the really key factors we need to watch? What's going to shape the outcome here?
I'd say two things stand out immediately. First, the sentencing logic itself. How does that lay judge panel articulate its decision? How explicitly do they acknowledge the mitigating factors, Yamagami's background, the church's role?
It's a balance they strike.
Exactly. A life sentence, for example, might signal to the public that the grievance was recognized, that the mitigating factors mattered. The death penalty, on the other hand, would send an absolute message. The state condemns political violence, full stop, regardless of motive. That balancing act in the ruling will be critical.
Okay, that's the immediate outcome. What about the longer-term factor? What determines whether this underlying sympathy for Yamagami fades away or just lingers indefinitely?
For me, that rests almost entirely on the appellate outcomes for the Unification Church. It raises a really important question, doesn't it? If the Tokyo court's ruling the one dissolving the church's religious status, if that ultimately stands on appeal.
If the institutional remedy feels complete.
Right. If it feels like the system has addressed the core problem, then maybe public tolerance or even sympathy for Yamagami might finally diminish. Because the source of his anger, the institutional grievance, will seem to have been fixed.
But the opposite is also true.
Absolutely. If the church wins its appeal, if that ruling gets overturned, then that core institutional grievance remains completely unaddressed in the public eye. And the feeling that Yamagami was, in some sense, unjustly victimized by this institution, and maybe even that the violence was somehow tragically necessary to force change, that feeling could linger for years.
It puts the court in such a difficult position.
They have to sentence a confessed killer while simultaneously managing the public fallout from a massive institutional failure that he, through violence, brought into the open.
It's quite extraordinary. The enduring popularity, or at least understanding for the killer, really does reveal the power of a scandal-plagued institution to shift public empathy away from the victim, Abe, and towards its loudest, most destructive critic. The immense challenge now for policymakers, for the courts, is how to effectively separate the push for legitimate institutional reform from the act of illegitimate violence. Because if they don't manage that separation clearly, well, they risk inadvertently letting political murder become seen by some as a template for achieving rapid policy change. A truly chilling thought.
Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs, and don't forget to like, comment, and share.